a world where many people see reality as a circle or a rectangle, the truth is that issues are cylinders. Rather than a two-dimensional understanding, we will flush out the three-dimension complexities through nuanced conversation and civil, respectable discourse to highlight all perspectives on controversial issues. I'm your host, William Roosh, a high school teacher who's trying to transform education as we know it. Welcome to the Anti-Echo Chamber. This is Cylinder Radio. Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I apologize, my voice is a little weak right now, but we're going through anyway because I have a guest today that I'm very excited that he was willing to do this podcast. He is an author, a speaker, a scholar, author of Excellent Sheep, a book that has really opened my eyes up to a lot of stuff, and I recommend it to a lot of teachers and administrators and things like that. So, William Deresiewicz, thank you so much for being on my podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me on.
So I'd like to get right into it, and there's a lot of things that I would like to talk about in our limited time. But can you maybe just give my audience who isn't familiar with Excellent Sheep, even though I've been promoting it on my podcast on my Instagram for a while, people haven't heard of it. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the point of the book is and kind of what you've been talking about, and you've done a lot of media and stuff like that on this area. Can you just maybe bring us in a little bit about what your message is?
Sure. I mean, it's a book about the selective college admissions process and the kinds of young people it produces. It's a critique of the kinds of young people it produces. It's not a critique of the people themselves, but it's a critique of what the system does to kids in the course of, kind of shoving them through this sieve that's supposed to get them to the college of their dreams. I talk about that, and then I talk about what we as a society, but more important, and what the schools, but more importantly, what individual young people can do to really rescue themselves from what I think is a very damaging system. And I should say that the book was based on my years teaching at Columbia and Yale. I was there at the two schools combined for almost 20 years. And also on the reaction that I got after I started to write about this, an enormously vigorous and, quite frankly, unexpected reaction after I published my first essay about this in 2008, where there was an outpouring of emails from students saying, thank you for putting this into words. And I've since been on a lot of college campuses, dozens and dozens, and I've heard more and more of these stories from kids, and that's what the book is based on. So it's for kids, it's for families, it's for people who teach in high schools, absolutely.
Do you get pushback the other side, too, of these institutions saying, like, no, that's not true, what we produce is amazing, and these are the leaders, and they're doing great things, and all that stuff?
Yeah, I got some pushback. Mainly I think they dealt with me by trying to ignore me. Mm-hmm. But, it was exactly the kind of boilerplate that you just kind of paraphrased. We produce leaders. I have a whole chapter in the book, as you know, on leadership, and it is a critique of the way this word leadership has been drained of meaning in the context of elite colleges. It's now used simply to signal the fact that we are going to produce what you'd really call winners. And, of course, that's a very ugly word, because when they're winners, they're losers. But that's really what they're saying. I think part of the problem with the system is that, yes, it does produce our leadership class, and it's producing very poor leaders precisely because of the way these kids are trained, among other things, to be really competitive and ambitious and think only about their own success.
Yeah, this is following a trend that I've gotten where I've read, Denise Pope's book, who I know you mentioned in your book, Overworked and Underprepared, Frank Bruni's book about, college and where you go is not who you'll be and things like that. And then this one, I feel like was a nice way to kind of wrap it all up and your personal experience from it. And yeah, I guess what it is these are the quote-unquote best and brightest that we have. These are the ones who are the most connected and the people who can do the most who are capable of maybe doing the most good in the world. A little bit of my background is I've taught for about 13 years high school in Los Angeles, and for the first 6 years I taught at very at-risk, low-income areas of Los Angeles, and then I moved over to a very high-income private school. So I've seen kind of both sides, and as much as I kind of felt like a sellout going into a private school, I started to also get experiences of some of these students going off and doing amazing things where the ripple effects were just huge, if they run a company the proper way, or these are kids who could hold public office or something like that. So I felt like actually more responsibility to try and to be a positive influence on them, because it would affect more people, where in the more low income areas, it was a more like you're just trying to look out for yourself and your decisions are for you, where with the kids I'm teaching now, it's like you're going to affect a lot of people in your community.
Yeah, well, on one level I agree with that, and I think this makes it especially problematic that so many of the people that elite colleges produce don't do that kind of thing at all. I mean, there's this rhetoric about making the world a better place, but if you look at the numbers, a huge percentage of kids who graduate from Harvard, Yale, Princeton, and other schools like that go into professions that really are not necessarily about making the world a better place, like banking and consulting. But I also want to kind of push back against what I think is a very understandable construct that you just presented, which is, these are the kids that are going to make a difference, and the lower income kids. I mean, that may be factually true, but it's a very unfortunate state of affairs. And one of the things that's come along with this, and I touch on this in the book, and I've written about it more, is this kind of upper-class messianism, that the way that social change happens, the way that the positive social political change happens, is that you get these quote-unquote best and the brightest who are stuffed with all kinds of privilege and advantage and resources, and then they go out and they bestow the benefits of their awesome wonderfulness on the less fortunate.
Yes.
This is not democracy. This is oligarchy. And the fact is that part of the big picture problem here is that we've radically defunded public higher education and public K-12 education for decades. And if you look, for example, at where the major party presidential nominees went to college, and I break this out in the book, as you know, in the last, since like 88, almost all of them have gone to elite colleges. In the decades after the war, from 48 to 84, almost none of them did. And a lot of them went to public universities. And what you outlined is a consequence of the fact that we've largely destroyed social mobility. And it should absolutely be possible for a kid from a low-income background, certainly from just a normal middle-income background, to get a great education at a public university and go on to assume important leadership positions in society, like the Supreme Court or the Senate or what.
Yeah.
And that happens less and less because the system has become less and less fair, and we funneled the training of our leadership class, of our elites, to a very small number of private institutions.
Yeah, and thank you for providing that pushback, because that's what I'm saying is when I went to the private school, I was like, oh, your parents know this politician? Oh, your uncle runs this company? It was such a new world for me, where the kids I was teaching before, just they even if they got to those schools, which was very, very rare, like they weren't connected at all. Like they didn't have any of those connections. So when I say that it wasn't ideal, it was just like, wow, this is a situation where you guys are so deeply entrenched in these power players, the people who make these decisions. And one of the dangers I see with this, you outline in the book about, like elitism, for that, that term, is you talk about, essentially along the lines of, you haven't had interactions with people different from you that on equal footing. And that was something that stood out to me when you said on equal footing, because there's a lot of people from very wealthy, connected backgrounds who have done charity work, or they have people that work for them, so they interact in this way or that, but not sitting there on equal footing, and yet they promote a lot of them promote very progressive, especially on campuses nowadays. Jonathan Haidt has laid out, a lot of the very progressive movements on college campuses, and this idea of I know what's best for you type of mentality, but you don't know this community in a way where you've actually talked as equals and really understand the situation of people in environments very different from yourself.
That's exactly right, and I think this is one of the fundamental, comprehensive failures of the liberal elite. And not to pick on Hillary Clinton, but this was so conspicuous in her campaign and in her way of talking to people, but not just her. I think,
right.
If that campaign had on its staff maybe a few less people who had done 13 AP courses in high school and a few more people who had just gone to regular public high schools that most kids go to. Mm-hmm. I think that campaign would have had its nerve endings much more firmly rooted in, never even mind the white working class. Like, even their own base, they really have no idea who these people are. And they're, the black community, the Latino community, they know this. They see this. But the liberal elite can't see it because they're so full of their own good intentions.
Yeah, and it's a lot of virtue signaling. It's a lot of, I care so much about this group of people, but from a distance. Like, I'm not going to have them into my house. There's a big thing about, people who, in certain areas of maybe Brooklyn or in Philly or something like that, and they'll push to make sure their kid goes to private school, and they'll get very upset if the kid has to go to a school that's more low income. But on the public sphere, all this stuff that happened with Aunt Becky from about the college admissions and stuff like that, I'm sure they were all very politically liberal and very much for equality and all that kind of stuff on the public front. But when it's in, it's not in my backyard type of thing, it has a gross feeling to it, because there's something to, I think, political left and right that outwardly we say this idea of elitism and stacking the game in your own favor and stuff is something that's gross.
Right, but everybody does it. When it comes to their kids, everybody does it. Just look at, both the Clintons and the Obamas had high school-age kids or school-age kids when they became president, and they both sent them to, like the fanciest private school in Washington, D.C. And that's when the rubber meets the road, that's where they are. I just want to say again, while it would be good if the liberal elite interacted with, or let's quote-unquote, ordinary people of all races as equals, what we really need is not people who come to those communities, but people who come from those communities.
Yes.
I want to see, a Democratic Party establishment and a liberal establishment in general that's coming from a representative cross-section of the country, not just that they happen to go to college with them. This would require a fundamental rethinking of the way we recruit and train and educate our leadership class, like a revolution. And that's what I talk about in the last chapter of the book. We need to discard the elite we have, just as we did 50 years ago when we discarded the WASP elite for a multicultural elite.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's there's so many different levels of how to do that. When I was teaching in the more at-risk schools, there were kids that got out, that kept their nose clean. They came to school and got jumped, and they were showed up in socks and stuff, and you could just see them under the breath. They're just like, F this place. And then they got out and went to college, and they just left it in their rear view. They didn't come back, and they didn't try to, and there's something to that where just there's so much anger from a lot. This is just my experience, but anger from this community where they came from that seems to be forgotten by kind of everybody. That when they get out, they don't come back and help as well. And I know some do, but I think that's an issue as well. Is that I've seen is that the kids who do get out, then they just become part of that elite. It's like OJ moving to Brentwood,
Right. Right.
And that's another element.
I sort of can't blame them as things are currently constituted.
Right.
But I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah. So something that I've seen at more private schools is, or more like elite schools, is this idea, and you outline this in the book as well, but this idea that kids will apply to 10 colleges, they'll get into 6, and then they will just choose the quote unquote best. And I talked to, after reading this book, I talked to some of my students in my advisory about this. I said, okay, guys, you get to pick. Do you want the Lamborghini, the Prius, the Jeep, or the motorcycle? And they were like, the Lamborghini. And I was like, well, too bad. You know what? It's really dense traffic. You should have picked the motorcycle. Or you know what? It was actually a drive through the desert and there's no roads. Probably should have picked the Jeep. And that is like a metaphor that really feels like the way that this college thing goes is that kids will just pick the best. And it's like, well, what is that? How is there the best as far as a college goes?
Well, that's right. And I mean, and it just shows you what also the college admissions bribery scandal shows us, that so much of this is really wrapped up in status, and it's not about what I would call really getting an education, but also more broadly helping prepare you to be an adult, which is what really, I mean, in a broader sense, what education should be for. When I say getting a real education, I also mean sort of intellectual depth and rigor and curiosity, and learning the literary philosophical history that formed our civilization. But even putting that aside, to me, the real highest goal is learning to be a person, learning to be an adult. And I don't think that that's a message that kids get in terms of like, this is what you should be doing with their education. But when they find themselves missing that, meaning when they find that their experience at school is not speaking to their deepest needs, to their deepest hungers for meaning, for purpose, for direction, when they feel like they can't even talk about these things, that they don't even know how to go about finding these things, when they look within themselves and realize, and sometimes you can almost literally wake up and realize this one day, like, holy crap, I've been miserable for a long time, right, and I don't know what to do about it. When those things happen to them, that's when they write me an email sometimes, right? I mean, those are the emails that I got. It was these and I still get them sometimes. Long confessionals full of a lot of pain, full of a lot of confusion. I felt lost. I just feel like I'm trapped in this system. And again, that was my point of departure. I mean, long before I got these emails, I was listening to students say these things to me in my office at Yale,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. It's funny you say it about being an adult. The first time I heard about your book, it was in Senator Ben Sass's book. I quoted your book, his book called The Vanishing of the American Adult. And he quotes your book in that because it was a lot of similar overlap in certain areas about how kids today aren't making adult decisions. They're not independent, and there's a lot of connection there. So I want to ask you a question about. Sorry, my voice is a little weak right now, but
that's all right.
You mentioned the concept of like. When kids don't know what they want to do, and I've seen that too. Like, what do you want to do? And they're like, I don't know. And I say, well, what do you like? And they say, I don't know. It's like, oh, jeez. And you address that in the book about just do what you like to do. And essentially, you'll eventually get paid for it. You can get good at it. You can study that. But what I want to ask you is, are you Mike Rowe, the guy who does like Dirty Jobs, that TV show? He has this concept where he says, instead of make your passion your career, turn your career into your passion. Like find something meaningful, something with purpose in what you do, even if it's cleaning toilets or something like that. And then maybe that will kind of get the same result or something like that. I was just curious when I heard that part, because I was listening to it and I was like, oh, that reminds me kind of what Mike Rowe has kind of pushed back against. If you can't find your passion, what are your thoughts on that idea?
I don't really think that's a very good idea. I mean, I understand that a lot of people don't have a lot of do not have a lot of vocational flexibility. And I think it's great. I was actually just reading about this, about how people find meaning in a lot of things, and sort of the people who clean floors and are miserable versus the people who clean floors and are kind of happy because they think about the fact that they're contributing to, the hospital and the people getting better, whatever it is. And that's great. But look, let's not be coy or naive or silly about this. I mean, a lot of jobs, anyone who really says that, I'm like, really? So you're just going to, pick a job out of a hat and you're going to be fine with that? I mean, I think it's easy to say this. It's easy to sort of give this advice to other people. But let me put it this way. You can also make both arguments together, right? You can say, look, you should try to find your way to work that's going to be meaningful to you, that seems like the right job. That's what I like to say. I don't like to talk about authenticity or even passion because I think that those are cliches and also they kind of set unreasonable expectations. But you want to be at a job that seems like the right job for you. I'm using my strengths, my talents. This is what I'm good at. It's in an area that I care about. And that's going to maximize your chances of feeling that your work is meaningful. To the extent that the actuality falls short of that, and it probably falls short for almost everybody, then sure, try to take what you've been handed and make it as meaningful as possible. But I would not start with that idea because I don't really think, whatever.
No,
there are a lot of jobs that are really soul deadening,
Yeah.
There are, and we shouldn't. And when we don't acknowledge that, we're assenting to the violence of the economic system,
right.
the spiritual violence, the emotional violence of that this economic system is inflicting on people.
No, yeah, I think that's a great answer. You do what you can, and in 2019, you can turn almost anything into a career. I tell my students that there are video game players who make $1 million a year. So you can turn so many things into a career, and so many middlemen have been taken out as far as publishers and record companies and all that kind of stuff. I'm doing this podcast from my bedroom. Now I have a radio program. There's so many opportunities out there. There's never been more opportunities. So you really can, enter yourself into the free market in a way that you want to and have passion. You don't have to work those jobs anymore. It's pretty great.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. The book that I'm currently writing is precisely about how artists make a living now. And the argument that you just outlined, this may be a little off topic for this podcast, okay, but the argument that you just outlined is very similar to what Silicon Valley has been putting out for a long time, that because of the internet, you can circumvent the middlemen and turn your passion into a career. That's not true. It might be true, but it's really not that simple. So, for instance, you have this podcast, and good for you, and you're doing good things. You're not making a living doing this podcast.
No,
and for you to get to the point where you can make a living, that's not only would require a lot of effort, but quite frankly, the odds are pretty long.
Right.
What my book documents, in fact, is that while it's true that you can create whatever you want, my book is about how people make a living at it. And if anything, it's gotten harder for various reasons that we don't need to go into. So, yes, I do think that the economy has opened up, and there are all kinds of possibilities now in a much more fluid and flexible economy than, say, the one of 40 years ago. But, and I advocate try to turn what you care about into a career, but it isn't necessarily going to be that easy. And I always say, always, the world is going to force you to make compromises. Don't think that it won't. Just make the compromises that are the best compromises for you to make.
Absolutely, yeah, and I hear you. I don't think it's easy. I do think it's easier, and even in business or something like that, creating online stores or creating even a website for yourself with all these, website builders and stuff like that. My wife owns a small business, and she had to build her website. She had to learn how to code because it was 10 years ago. Where now you can just drag and drop stuff. I'm not, I wouldn't say to especially young people like, oh, you wanna, be a singer? Go for it. It's so easy now because all the barriers are gone. I'm not saying that. I just do think that if you look throughout time, as far as, maybe I'm wrong, let me know if I am, but as far as I know, if you look throughout American history, the opportunities to do what you want to do and follow your passion have never been greater. But maybe that's not true.
Well, again, the opportunities to do what you want to do and follow your passion have never been greater. The opportunities to support yourself doing that, no.
You think it was better in the past to make a living doing what you are passionate about?
Well, I'm writing a book about the arts, so I'm not going to say your passion in general. And if your passion is to run a small business, then maybe it's easier. Although actually small business creation is way down over the last few decades as the economy increasingly is dominated by monopolies. That's something people don't talk about. Small business creation is way down. But in terms of the arts, basically, full-time working artists who are actually successful as artists, in other words, they were not financially successful, but recognized by their peers, critical acclaim, worked steadily. That used to be a middle-class job description, and now it's a working-class job description at best. I mean, it is much. Artists are successful artists are poorer. It's much harder to do it. First of all, there are two big reasons for this. One is more people are trying to do it. The other one is the internet economy has sucked a lot of the money out of the arts, right? Music is free now. People don't pay for music. Right? So how's a musician supposed to make a living? Well, go on tour. Okay, but everybody's touring. And also, you can't do that, indefinitely because your body collapses. That's the reality.
Yeah. It's like a weird thing because I know people who are independent musicians and they couldn't get picked up by a record label, so they put it out on YouTube and then they go tour and they do make some money. But then again, maybe they would make more if there was a record company. I don't know. Well, I'm interested in reading the book.
Are they supporting themselves doing it?
Yeah, a few of them. Yeah.
And they're not independently wealthy.
They're making enough money to drive a new Nissan Sentra. It's
whatever. There's a range.
Yeah.
There's a range, but there's statistics beyond what I'm saying, and I also did a lot of interviews for this book, both with individual musicians and with advocates and with people in the industry. There's one story that's out there. That's the story that you articulated that, like I said, Silicon Valley loves to push because they want us to use their tools and their platforms. Never been easier. You can turn your passion into a career, and then there's the reality. No, you can put your stuff out there. Turning it into a career is very, very difficult. It's harder than it used to be.
So, just talking about the long shots and stuff like that, and to bring it back to college and the way that the system is with getting to these elite colleges and these feeder high schools that push the AP courses, and you gotta do these extracurriculars and play these sports and help in these charities and build up your resume, so to speak. How I know you want to disrupt this system. Is it something that could be disrupted? How is that going to happen? And I know that you're doing your part and I'm doing my part, and I'm trying to spread your message because I believe that it needs to be disrupted. I think it's in everyone's best interest in this country for it to be disrupted. But it is deeply rooted, and with things that are so deeply rooted, not easy to fix. Is this something that do you see it being improved?
Well, I always answer this on two levels. There's the individual level and the systemic or societal level. And my book is mainly about the individual level because what I say to students, and I say to parents, I actually have been speaking at more and more high schools lately, always to parents, sometimes also to students. You have the freedom to make different choices. If this is making you miserable, know that you don't have to do it. You're going to give up status, maybe, but first of all, there's been a really well-conducted study. It was actually done twice because people didn't believe the results the first time. And what it showed is that unless you're from a marginal community, but you're just like a typical middle class, upper middle class, white kid, Asian kid. Or I think if you're upper middle class, even if you're Latino or black, it doesn't matter where you go in terms of your future earnings. It's counterintuitive because the average salary of, say, a Stanford grad is much higher than a public, University of Oregon grad. But that's because of the people they attract. If you actually match people who went to Stanford with people who got in but went to Oregon instead, which is what the study did, you don't find a difference in average future earnings, which tells you that at least in terms of your financial future, what matters is you and not the school. Now, again, status is different. If you want to be on the Supreme Court or work at Morgan Stanley, probably you have to go to Stanford. But then you have to ask yourself, like, what really matters to me? And then you have to ask yourself, is this making me miserable? And I always tell high school students, and they always gasp when I say this. I say, it's not going to get better once you get to college. I know you think that it is, but you're going to relax and you've made it. Well, no, because you get to college and 3 weeks later you start to hear about this whole new set of hurdles and brass rings and hoops that you have to jump through, and then you're competing for that. And then you get out of college, and it's medical school or law school or whatever it is, and it doesn't stop until you make it stop. So that's the message, right? You can make choices, and you're not dooming yourself to poverty if you don't go to an elite college. You're not dooming your children to poverty if you don't shove them through this machine.
Yeah, they believe that, though. Maybe not deeply,
believe
but
it.
Yeah.
Parents believe it, but you know what? More and more parents are recognizing that it's not worth the trade-off of their kids' happiness, and they see it because, it's one thing if a kid says, this sucks, I'm miserable, but we're talking about very serious psychological problems that a lot of kids have, up to and including suicide. And as you may know, there was a suicide cluster in the Palo Alto high schools in 2009. They did a lot of talking, a lot of meetings, a lot of this and a lot of that. And then in 2015, there was another suicide cluster in the same school, okay? So that's when parents start to pay attention, right? Or whatever it is. It could be cutting, eating disorders, substance abuse. The book to read about this, among others, is The Price of Privilege by Madeline Levine, who's an ally of Denise Clark Pope. They started something based at the Stanford Ed School called Challenge Success, which goes into high schools and works on exactly these issues. And there are more and more schools. They're in more and more schools all the time. So that's the individual piece. And then the systemic piece, that's going to be much harder. This is rooted in issues that go well beyond education. It's rooted in what I referred to earlier, in inequality and slowing social mobility. And the reason that so many parents are stampeding to these schools is that we've done everything we can to destroy the amazing public university systems, especially the one in California, that we built in the decades. We actually started to build them during the Civil War, but they really boomed in the decades after World War II. And that's when inequality contracted. We created the world's first mass middle class.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. And so we did it, and we could go and do it again, but it's going to take a lot of political will. Listen, what is this really about? It's about how resources are allocated in a society.
Yeah.
When you talk about, the college admissions process, we focus on how hard the kids work. And that's fair. They do work very hard to, accumulate these resumes. But they've also been stuffed with educational resources from the moment, I was going to say literally from the moment they could walk, maybe even before they could walk.
Yeah.
And so the very opportunity to take you can only take 13 AP classes if you go to a school that offers 13 AP classes, right? So whether it's through their families, through their schools, through their communities, they've been given enormously unequal levels of resources compared to other kids, not just poor kids. Again, also just the vast numbers in the middle. Also.
Right. Yeah, and I go back. I'm sorry to keep going back to the politics thing, but this is very interesting to me because part of this podcast I do go into politics because I think that we are so divided down political lines right now in this country, and this is something that we should, most of us are not the elite. Okay, and some of us are, red hat wearers, and some of us are Bernie people, but this is something we should all get on board with. Like, we outnumber them, like this is something that we can really come together, get educated about, and try and push for a change. But it's not getting touched by the politicians, because I'm guessing and not to be like tin hat wearing, like, Jones guy, but it seems like these are the donors, and these are the people who are in control of a lot of these politics and stuff like that. So I don't know, like do you know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I don't think that this is entirely true. I mean, when one of the things I talk about in the book is going back to free, high quality public higher education, and also a more equitable distribution of funding for K through 12 education. And I'm not going to say I was the first one to talk about that. There were people talking about it, not many people. That was 2014. Mm-hmm. Now, free public higher education is becoming, I'm not going to say the default position for Democrats, but for a lot of Democrats. The reason that we're not going to have, sort of the mass of people, the 90%, 95% coming together around the solutions that I'm outlining, is because they're progressive solutions. They're essentially the kind of democratic socialism or social democracy that Bernie Sanders and AOC and Elizabeth Warren are talking about. But they are talking about it. I mean, there's now a significant wing in the Democratic Party that's talking about exactly these things. Raise taxes on the wealthy significantly. Fund free public higher education. I imagine they're also talking about changing our funding models for K through 12. I think that's less prominent, but I'm sure they're doing it. Because our K through 12 funding system is designed to reinforce inequality. What's the main source of K through 12 funding? It's local property taxes, right? No other country, no other advanced country does this. And when you fund through local property taxes, you end up with schools that can be 10 miles apart, where the funding per pupil can be one school 10 times as much as the other school in the inner city 10 miles away.
Right. Yeah, I see that in LA.
But in order to implement the program that I just outlined, a lot of people in the top, not just 1%, but 10%, maybe even 20%, are going to have to give up a lot of what they have so that other kids, other families can have more. Now, we've done that in the past. It's called being civic-minded. It's called putting country first, or maybe just putting long-term interests first, ahead of the very, very short-term thinking. I mean, because ultimately we all benefit when everybody's resources, the human resources, as we say, are tapped for the benefit of everybody else. When we're leaving 90% of our brains and our talent on the table, we're not ultimately helping ourselves.
Yeah, we don't have to go down this road, too deep. But when you say like free state college and stuff like that, when I went to college and I went to a state school in Pennsylvania, if you would have asked me when I was 17, 18 years old, why did you choose this college? I really would have said, well, it's a place to party. Like, I didn't go in, like, now I look at college like, oh my gosh, you just get to learn anything you want, get deep. That sounds incredible. But there are a lot of, young people who look at it like this is just a chance to party and go nuts and stuff like that. And I guess I would see free college tuition would be great if it was learning something for the sake of learning or for vocational skills or something like that. But I do worry that it would be something that isn't taken seriously, because from my experience and a bunch of people, the majority, I would say, of people that I knew growing up going to these state schools, it was not college for the way that we would intend and hope for the kids to go to college.
Was college free?
No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't.
No.
So what you're saying has nothing to do with whether college is free or not. There are plenty of kids at private universities who have the exact same attitude towards college. I mean, I understand you're speaking from your experience, but it's also a stereotype of a certain kind of college student. And again, it's irrelevant whether college is free or not. Most college students, I would venture to say, do not have that attitude. First of all, 40% of people who go to college in this country are going to community colleges. Lots of people who go to four-year state institutions They may be a little older. They may be working 20 hours a week, 40 hours a week. They're not the party bros.
Right.
Those may be the most visible. Did you go to Penn State?
I did, yeah.
You know, I mean, at campuses like that, that's a thing. And I think that's been a thing for a long time. The truth is that, well, let's not go down there. But, I mean, you know, it's a big football school. I would venture to say that a lot of people at Penn State didn't act that way. But, listen, this is what young people are going to do. I did a lot of drinking in college, too. I don't think it's about free or not free.
Okay, yeah.
And also, let me just say that when college was free, back that high, that golden age in the post-war period, when for the first time, you know, really large numbers of Americans started to go to college, which means it wasn't just drawing from the upper classes. You had working-class kids, middle-class kids. That was when the humanities majors had their highest enrollments as a percentage, right? So, because the idea is like, well, you know, humanities are just for, like, rich kids who have the luxury. No. When people have the freedom to study what they want because they're not worried about financial pressure and student debt, a lot of kids choose to study things like philosophy and English and religious studies, right? And one of the big reasons those numbers have gone down is because, if you're paying a lot of money for school, you're probably less likely to take that chance, to give yourself 4 years to really learn.
Yeah, I mean, and that's an aim that I'm really trying to go for, is getting kids to want to learn for the sake of learning. And it's challenging at both. It's challenging at the at-risk public schools for a whole, you know, litany of reasons, and then challenging at these private schools for a whole different set of reasons. But it is the challenge across the board. Just in closing, I do want to say that, you know, the kind of subtitle to your book about seeking meaning. That's something that's come up. This is my, I think, 15th podcast, and it's something that's come up a lot, talking about a whole bunch of different things, talking about depression and talking about all kinds of different, you know, the drug overdoses that are, you know, I think suicide is at like one of its all-time highest rates in American history. Opiate overdoses, it was like 70,000 people overdosed last year. And I think that there is a crisis of meaning in this country. I think that, you know, for whatever reason, because life has gotten, you know, very comfortable for a lot of ways, for people just being isolated, for whatever reason it is. And I think that using higher education and using your time in college to be focused on that, how do I find meaning and how do I find purpose and how do I build me and who I'm supposed to be and how I'm supposed to contribute to this world, is something that's very lacking. So I just wanted to appreciate, that's one of the biggest things that I see coming up over and over again. And I'm glad that was a focus point of the book.
Yeah, and I think in the case of the kinds of students we've been talking about, the kinds of students that you're teaching now, I think, it's very much tied, that sense of a lack of meaning is very much tied up with this system that we've been talking about, where students are told to compete for these external rewards for the name of the college they get into, for various accolades, and they know that ultimately they're competing for wealth and status. And I'm not downplaying the value of not being poor, and I'm not downplaying the ego gratification of status, but I think everybody understands, ultimately, just, you know, if that's all you have and all you're going for, it feels very empty. It feels empty because it doesn't connect you to anything. I mean, meaning is about connecting you to things. But the problem is that kids are taught to pay attention to that stuff and not to what they feel connected to.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, you talked about wanting your kids to learn for its own sake. That's not a separate concept, right? I mean, when you're learning for its own sake, what you mean is you're learning for the gratification of learning. You're learning to satisfy your curiosity. You're learning to follow your deeper desires, your intrinsic desires, not the extrinsic motivation of the hoops and the brass rings, right? So when you let yourself learn for its own sake, be a kid, figure out, like you said before, like, do what you like. That's what meaning emerges from.
Yeah.
That's what it emerges from.
Yeah.
It's like, I've chosen this. This is meaningful to me. This feels, this sort of, we assign meaning to things. I've been thinking about this in terms of the word value and values, but I think that's very connected to meaning. valuing is an emotional process. Like, what makes one person value one thing and one person value something else? It's not objective. It's like, which of the things responds to your desires? Which of them gives you a feeling that's the feeling that you want? And that's what kids need help paying attention to and need encouragement in pursuing. And that's what's going to help them choose values that feel like their values and lead a life that's going to feel meaningful to them, which, again, it's just like the life that they should be living, the life that feels like the right life for them.
Yeah, and you mentioned happiness, and happiness is one thing. I think meaning is even like a deeper level than that, because happiness you can get hedonistically. You can get that in a pill. You can get that in maybe in money and getting a jet ski and stuff like that. But when the statistics on who is depressed and who is heavily medicated on antidepressants and stuff like that, it is pretty directly correlated to it's a certain group, and it is these more wealthy, affluent, white groups of people who and so I don't think that can be ignored. But meaning is something that you can't. It's not something that's maybe easily attainable. I don't know if that's the right word, but it is something that's a deeper level, and because happiness can also be very selfish.
Yeah, well, I mean, maybe we would choose different words, but I take your point.
Yeah.
And right, 3 of the occupational groups that show the lowest levels of happiness and the highest indices of unwellness are doctors, lawyers, and bankers. I mean, if you talk about substance abuse, life expectancy, just whether depression, whether they hate their job, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's the data is in. So now we have the data, and now we can try and move forward and do something about it. Bill, thank you so much for doing this podcast. I really appreciate it. I know it's a little late at night now for us, but I'm going to put this out there, and I'm growing my following among high school students and high school teachers. And I really think for parents, teachers, administrators, check out the book. Okay, go on YouTube and look up William Deresiewicz, and please just go down this road a little bit. Talk to your kids, and let's just start this, like you said, on an individual level. And for the kids out there who feel very trapped and feel like they're going down this road, read the book. Just read the book, and it might give you a little bit of encouragement to push back and try something else. And the data shows that you'll be okay, and we have to use data. We have to use that to base what our reality is. So thank you. Is there anything in closing about where people can find you or pick up your book and anything like that you want to plug?
The book is Excellent Sheep. It's very easy to find. I have a website. It's BillDeresiewicz.com, but if that's too hard to spell, I think if you just Google Excellent Sheep, it'll be very easy for you to find my website. And there's a contact me link there. I love to hear from people. I love to speak at high schools. If there are people who want me to come and speak at their high schools, I was just at one in San Luis Obispo, not too far from where you are. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for listening.